The snow came early that year, uninvited and hungry, draping its white shroud over the prairie like a burial cloth. Cold didn't usually settle in these parts until November, but this storm had crept down from the mountains in October, fierce and silent, like death itself. And out there in the white, barefoot and bleeding, Eliza stumbled westward, arms wrapped around her thin frame, a broken locket clenched in her fist like it held the last spark of her soul. Behind her, the little settlement of Dry Hollow disappeared into the swirling blizzard. Good Christian folk, they called themselves, men who spoke the Lord's name with fire on their tongues and cruelty in their bones. They whispered behind her back, since the barn fire took her husband 6 months ago. Rumors bred like rats. Said she'd been cursed, that she spoke to coyotes, that she danced with the devil when the moon was full. They never needed proof, just a scapegoat. Eliza had begged them, pleaded with Reverend Langley as tears froze to her cheeks. But mercy was not a word they carried anymore. They wanted her gone. They wanted her erased. So they locked her in the woodshed on the edge of the town, tossed in a crust of bread, and nailed the door shut. Let the snow do the Lord's work. Inside, the shed reeked of rat dung and rusted tools. She'd screamed until her throat cracked, pounded until her knuckles split. Then she went quiet, sitting in the dark, listening to the wind build its rage outside. Death crept in under the door, slow, patient. But Eliza had never been good at dying. She found a rusted shovel, used it like a hammer, bashing the window until the jagged edges shattered inward. One hand over glass, she pulled herself through, shredding her arm but not stopping until her boots crunched into snow. She didn't even look back. Not at the shack, not at the town, not at the church whose bell hadn't rung for her since her husband died. She walked. Every step tore open another layer of flesh, each breath a dagger in her lungs. Her wool dress hung soaked and heavy, one sleeve torn clean off. A thin line of blood trailed behind her in the snow, like a thread leading back to betrayal. It was almost funny. She had no direction, just away from their eyes, their lies, their fire-branded crosses. The wind howled like a wounded beast. Coyotes answered. Eliza's knees buckled near a frozen creek. Her palms sank into the drift. The cold wasn't biting anymore. It was gentle, lulling. Her mother used to say that dying in snow felt like sleep. That thought scared her more than anything, because in that moment it sounded like mercy. She collapsed under a twisted pine, the world narrowing to the rhythm of her heart, slowing, stuttering. Her hand found the locket, still in her pocket, still unbroken. Inside was the only picture she had left of herself before the fire, before her husband's hands got mean, before the miscarriages, before her smile disappeared. She wasn't running from grief. She was running from what grief had turned her into. Just as the dark closed in, she heard it. Hoofbeats. Steady, calm, not the reckless gallop of bounty or bullets, but the deliberate rhythm of someone who knew the land. Her fingers twitched. The shape emerged through the storm, tall, broad-shouldered, mounted on a paint horse with a red streak down its mane like war paint. He dismounted without a word. His face was half shrouded by a hood, sharp-eyed, unreadable. Snow melted on his cheekbones. His boots stopped beside her. She couldn't speak, only blinked. He crouched, his gloved hand pressing gently to her neck, checking for life. She found her voice, barely a whisper. "I don't want to die." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. With one motion, he scooped her into his arms and carried her to the horse. The warmth of his chest pressed against her, steady, living. The locket slipped from her hand, but she couldn't make herself care. The world rocked gently with each hoof fall. The blizzard swallowed their tracks behind them. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was enemy or savior. But in his silence, there was no judgment, no scripture, just action. Her last memory before darkness took her was the red stripe in the horse's mane, like fire cutting through frost. The wind screamed all night. When she woke, it was to warmth and the crackle of fire. A scent of sage and pine smoke filled the air. Her lashes fluttered open, vision blurring against flickering shadows. Thick animal pelts blanketed her. She was in a structure, rounded, earthen. A hogan, The walls breathed with the wind, but did not bend to it. She moved. Pain needled through her arm and thigh. She hissed. A figure shifted near the fire, casting tall shadows against the mud wall. He was there, the same man, wrapped in a long, fur-lined coat. He glanced over, eyes catching hers like a match to dry kindling. They stared at each other for a long beat. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, measured. "You walked far." Her throat ached. "Not far enough." He nodded once, like he understood. "You're hurt." "I noticed." That drew a ghost of a smile from him. He moved closer, kneeling. His hands were weathered but clean. He held a small bowl, steam rising from it, the scent of cedar and crushed herbs. "This will help." She didn't resist as he applied the mixture to her arm. It burned, but not as much as the silence had. Not as much as betrayal. "You're Navajo?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "My name is Tasani." "Eliza." He gave a short nod, as if sealing a pact. She watched his hands. Efficient, practiced, no wasted movement. A man who had done this before. "Why'd you help me?" He paused. "Because they left you." His words were simple, unadorned, but they landed like an anvil in her chest. "They left you." He didn't ask what she had done, didn't accuse or assume, just named the truth. Her throat tightened. She looked away, blinking furiously. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. "You're not." The fire cracked between them. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the silence grew gentler. She drifted into sleep again, lulled by the heat and the strange calm in her chest. Something had changed. Something deep. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt safe. When she woke again, it was to the sound of him sharpening a blade. Not an alarm. Just preparation. The scent of cooked rabbit hung in the air. Her stomach growled. Tasani handed her a strip of meat without a word. She ate slowly, eyes never leaving him. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked. His jaw tensed slightly. "Lost someone." She didn't pry. The pain in his voice said enough. The way he avoided the firelight. The scar on his cheekbone that looked like it came from more than just war. Grief knows grief. It recognizes itself. They sat in silence, a different kind now, one that filled the space without needing to explain itself. Outside, the storm began to die. She looked at him, this quiet man with scars and soft eyes, and thought, he saved me without asking for a single thing. No price, no judgment, no chains. She wasn't sure what that made him, but he wasn't like the men from Dry Hollow. And for the first time, she wasn't thinking about how to survive tomorrow. She was thinking about tonight, about the fire, about him, and the strange, terrifying possibility that maybe she hadn't been walking toward death. Maybe she'd been walking toward this. Eliza woke to a world she didn't recognize. The storm had passed, leaving behind silence so deep it hummed. Outside the walls of the Hogan, the snow still blanketed the earth, but inside, a fire danced low in its pit, casting trembling shadows across the earthen walls. Her wounds throbbed beneath the layers of salve and cloth. She could feel every bruise, every splinter of pain, but she was warm, alive. She sat up slowly, the pelts falling away from her shoulders. The air smelled of juniper smoke, cedar, and something richer, spice meat, perhaps. Her stomach tightened in protest. A kettle simmered beside the hearth. Across from it, Tasani sat cross-legged, head bowed over something in his hands. He was carving. The knife moved with deliberate, silent skill, shaving curls of wood from a block. His presence was steadying, like the mountain itself. He looked up. Their eyes met, and he gave the faintest nod. "You should eat." She nodded, almost apologetically. He rose and ladled a thick stew into a wooden bowl, then offered it to her. She took it with both hands, letting the heat soak into her fingers. Venison, roots, dried berries, rich, earthy, unfamiliar, but good. She ate slowly, eyes flicking between spoonfuls to his face. "Thank you," she said. He only inclined his head, going back to his carving. She studied him, his high cheekbones, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes didn't wander or question. He was a man carved from silence, but not the kind that tried to hide. No, his quiet had weight, purpose. "I don't think I would have made it another mile," she said. Her voice cracked, dry from sleep. "Truth is, I didn't think I'd make it all." Tasani didn't look up. "You kept walking." "That wasn't strength," she muttered. "That was anger." "Sometimes," he said, finishing the carving and blowing dust from its surface, "they are the same." She looked down at her bowl, throat tightening. He handed her the carving, a rabbit, delicate and smooth, with long ears folded back like it was mid-leap. "I made this," he said simply. She turned it over in her hands. It was beautiful, unnecessary, thoughtful. "Why?" she asked. He met her gaze, and in his silence, she felt the unspoken words. "Because someone should." Outside, the wind shifted. A bird cried high above, maybe a hawk. Time moved strangely in this place. No ticking clocks, no church bells, no morning routines. Just the fire, the wind, and the quiet between breaths. She finished her stew. Her fingers still trembled slightly, but the warmth in her chest had begun to push back the cold inside her. "I should leave soon," she murmured. Tasani's brow furrowed. "You are not well." "I can't stay here forever." "Not forever," he said. "Just until you stop flinching in your sleep." She stilled. He rose and stepped outside. She could hear the crunch of snow underfoot, the call of his horse nearby. She sat in that silence, the rabbit in her lap, the fire cracking in low rhythms like a drumbeat. When he returned, he brought firewood and a small satchel of herbs. He didn't speak, but he placed a warm stone by her feet and gently wrapped a pelt around her shoulders again. His touch was careful, respectful, not the way her husband had touched her, gripping, bruising. No, this was different. "You have a family?" she asked. "Had," he said. "What happened?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, sickness came last winter. "My wife, my sister's son, both gone." Her throat closed. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "You." She looked at the fire. "Husband died in a fire. Barn collapsed. They said it was my fault." "Was it?" She met his gaze. "No, but they needed someone to blame. I was already barren. What good is a woman who can't give children, can't work the field, can't save a man from his own drunken clumsiness?" Tasani didn't blink. A woman who survives is not worthless. She felt it then, shame rising in her chest like bile, not because of his words, but because of how foreign they felt. She'd been told for so long that she was less than nothing. She'd begun to believe it. She swallowed hard. "Thank you for saying that." He reached for a small bag, pulled out a handful of cornmeal, and began preparing a new meal. The movements were rhythmic, almost meditative. She watched him in silence. When the food was cooking, he finally asked, "What was in the locket?" She blinked. "You found it." He reached into his coat and placed the silver locket in her palm. She opened it slowly. The photo was smudged now, the edges warped by snow and blood. But it was still her. 5 years younger, eyes bright, hair pinned up, smile untouched by sorrow. "I used to believe that girl would do something great," she whispered. "Now I'm just trying to stay alive." Tasani looked at her, not pitying but steady. "You still can." Her breath caught. She closed the locket and tucked it close to her heart. That night, she dreamed of fireless sky and stars that blinked like they were watching her. When she stirred, she found herself curled near the fire. Tasani had draped another pelt over her. He sat a few feet away, back to her, keeping watch. In the morning, she insisted on helping with chores. She fetched water from the creek, her gait stiff but improving. He taught her how to grind herbs, how to recognize the tracks of rabbits and coyotes in the snow. They moved together with the rhythm of people who'd known each other longer than a few days. There was a comfort in the silence, in not having to explain everything, in being seen and still safe. He gave her simple words in Dine: water, fire, wind. She fumbled the pronunciations, laughing when she got them wrong. He smiled wide this time, and something inside her cracked open. Something that had been buried since her first miscarriage. Laughter. It made her dizzy. "You speak little," she said that night. but you listen better than anyone I've ever met." He looked at her. Words are wind. Deeds are stone. She let those words settle in her chest, then nodded. They shared dried apples and venison. She asked him about the red stripe in his horse's mane. He told her it was for his brother, lost in a raid long ago. The color honored him. Meant he still rode with them in spirit. He didn't cry when he said it, but she felt the sorrow in his voice like a crack beneath ice. Silent but deep. That night, the wind returned. It wasn't the same as before. This storm was distant, but something about the way Dasani watched the fire unsettled her. He didn't sleep. She waited, listening to the storm's approach. Then she whispered, "Something's coming, isn't it?" He didn't answer right away. "Yes," he said at last. She sat up. "The town?" He nodded once. "Men were riding west yesterday. I saw them on the ridge." "Looking for me?" "I don't know, but they ride with purpose." Her fingers curled around the pelt. "They'll come to kill me." Tasani's face hardened. "Then they will fail." He said it like stating the weather. She looked at him, his profile etched in firelight, and something inside her shifted again. Not fear this time. Something colder, sharper, resolve. She leaned forward. "I'm not going to run again." He turned toward her, not surprised. "Then we prepare." They held each other's gaze. No promises, no speeches, just shared fire and a future neither of them had asked for. Outside, the snow fell softer now, but the world beyond the Hogan had begun to stir. The sun broke pale and cold over the ridge, turning the snow into a vast, blinding sheet of white. Birds didn't sing that morning. The trees stood stiff and quiet, as if the forest itself knew what was coming. Tasani stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on the horizon. His arms were crossed, his breath rising in quiet clouds. Eliza watched him from the doorway of the Hogan, hands buried in the sleeves of her borrowed coat. Her wounds had healed enough to let her move, though the cold still sent needles through her skin. He hadn't spoken much that morning. He didn't need to. The silence between them had shifted again, no longer the soft hush of trust, but the talk quiet before a storm. She stepped forward. "You saw them again." He gave a slow nod, never taking his eyes from the tree line. 4 riders. 2 wore red scarves. Dry, hollow men. She exhaled, slow and sharp. "I know who that is." "Are they dangerous?" "They're worse than dangerous," she muttered. "They're believers." Tasani's jaw twitched. Eliza stepped beside him, her voice firm. "They'll say I bewitched the town, that I killed my husband and escaped judgment. They'll say they're here to finish the Lord's work." Tasani didn't flinch. "You won't run?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, not again." He turned to her then, truly looked at her, this woman who had been left for dead, who now stood with her spine straight and her eyes sharp. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded once, accepting her answer as truth. "We have until sundown." She helped him prepare. They hid the horse in a narrow crevice beyond the trees, camouflaged beneath pine branches and dusted snow. They reinforced the Hogan's entrance with logs and sharpened stakes. Inside, they packed what they could carry into satchels: dried meat, salves, fire tools, spare blades. Eliza found a hunting knife and strapped it to her thigh. She'd never used one before, but when she looked at her reflection in the steel, she didn't see fear. She saw something closer to justice. Later, while Tasani carved fresh arrow shafts, Eliza sat on a stone outside, hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea. Her thoughts spun like dry leaves, each one darker than the last. "They won't leave," she said. "No," Tasani agreed. "They'll follow us. Even if we kill 1 or 2, they'll come with more next time. Bring the preacher. The whole town, maybe." Tasani didn't answer immediately. "Then we end it." She blinked. "You want to go back?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I want to stop running. I stopped the day you found me." A moment passed between them. Not long, but heavy. He reached into the folds of his coat and pulled something out. Her locket. She had thought she'd lost it again. He pressed it into her palm. "Wear it," he said, "for strength." She clasped it around her neck, the chain cool against her skin. Then she reached for his hand, hesitated, and took it anyway. He didn't pull away. They stood together until the light began to change. Dusk came with an unnatural stillness. Not a breeze stirred. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Then came the sound of hooves. Eliza stepped inside the hogan, eyes wide, pulse thudding behind her ears. Tasani crouched near the fire pit, bow in hand, arrows laid out in a fan beside him. He had placed one beside her knife, an invitation, not an order. Outside, voices rose. Laughter, the creak of saddles, the thud of boots hitting earth. "Come on out, witch," a voice called. "Ain't no sense in hiding." Eliza closed her fingers around the hilt of her knife. Her heart was thundering, but her hands were steady. "We just want to talk," another voice sneered. "Well, and maybe hang you afterward, but that's the Lord's justice." Tasani's expression didn't change. He motioned for her to stay low. Then he moved to the edge of the doorway and peered through the opening. 3 men stood in the clearing, one tall and thick, with a red scarf and a broad, sneering mouth. Elijah Griggs, her late husband's brother. Beside him, Jonas and Dent, the preacher's sons, both mean-eyed and twitchy, guns slung over their shoulders. Eliza remembered when she used to sell them pies. She wondered if they remembered, too. Griggs stepped forward. "Reckon you got a redskin hiding you, girl," he shouted. "That's real Christian of you. You gonna come out, or we gotta smoke you out like badgers?" Eliza looked at Tasani. He gave a slight nod. She stood up. "Then we do this now," she whispered. Before she could think twice, she stepped into the doorway. The men went still when they saw her. Griggs laughed. "Well, look what the crows dragged in. Didn't freeze after all, huh? You came all this way just to die," she called out. "Was I really that much trouble to you?" He spread his arms, mocking. "You think you get to walk away? After what you did? I survived. That's not a crime. Witchcraft is." Tasani's voice cut through the clearing like a blade. "Go back." The men turned. Griggs sneered. "Oh, there he is. Hero of the snow. You speak English, boy?" Tasani didn't move. "Last warning." Griggs lifted his rifle. "You got 3 seconds to give her up." Eliza didn't wait for the rest. She raised a knife and threw it. It struck Dent in the leg. He screamed and dropped, his rifle clattering into the snow. Gunfire exploded. Tasani rolled left, loosing an arrow that buried into Jonas's chest. The boy stumbled back, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. He collapsed without a word. Griggs fired wildly, yelling curses, reloading as he ducked behind a tree. Eliza lunged for Dent's fallen rifle. Blood soaked the snow. She grabbed the weapon, turned, fired. The shot missed, but it was close enough that Griggs cursed and retreated deeper into the trees. Tasani moved like water, smooth and fast, circling the flank. Eliza crouched by the hogan, breathing hard. Smoke rose from the rifle's muzzle. Her hand shook now, not from fear, from adrenaline, from fury. Then a scream. Tasani emerged from the trees, blood on his blade. "It's done," he said. She rose slowly, stepped toward him. Her legs felt hollow, like they might give. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded. "Griggs is dead." She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She just looked down at the snow, at the blood staining it red. 3 men had come here to kill her. Only one of them got a warning, and she didn't feel sorry. She met Tasani's gaze. "What now?" "We move." They gathered supplies quickly, packed only what was needed. She kept the locket around her neck, tied the rifle across her back. As they mounted the horse, Tasani in front, Eliza behind, she looked back once at the smoldering fire inside the hogan. Not a home, not anymore, but a place where something had been reborn. They rode west, cutting through the trees, moving fast. Eliza leaned into Tasani's back, her arms around his waist. "They'll come again," she said. "The town. Maybe more of them." He didn't argue. "They will," she repeated. He looked over his shoulder. "Then we stopped running." Her eyes met his. They rode into the twilight together. And behind them, Dry Hollow began to stir with rumors and rage. The days that followed were raw and silent, filled with hard miles and long shadows. They didn't speak much, and they didn't need to. The quiet between Eliza and Tasani had changed again. It was no longer the hush of strangers, nor the breathless silence before battle. It was a stillness of two people bound by something deeper than words. They camped in a canyon ringed with red stone, hidden beneath a jagged overhang where the firelight couldn't be seen from above. Snow still dusted the high ridges, but spring whispered to the valley in slow, defiant green shoots. Tasani moved with purpose, scouting during the day, sharpening blades by night. Eliza watched him from across the fire, studying the way he'd become something between a shield and a mirror. He didn't pretend she wasn't changed. He saw the fire in her now, fed it. On the third night, he took her to the top of a bluff. Below them stretched the land he called home, wide, untamed, glorious. The sky above them burned with stars. He knelt beside a stone cairn, fingers brushing over its surface. She knew it was even before he spoke. "My wife lies here," he said softly. "She died of the sickness that came with the snow. I buried her with her favorite dress. Her horse died 2 days after." Eliza stood in reverent silence, hands clasped. "You loved her?" He nodded. "Still do. Love doesn't stop. It just shifts." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "You think she'd hate me? For being here now?" "No," he turned toward her, his gaze steady. "She'd thank you for pulling me back from the mountain's edge." A long wind passed through the canyon. Below, the fire flickered. Eliza stepped closer to him. "I don't know what I am anymore," she admitted. "Widow, fugitive, killer." "You are a woman who lived," he said. "That's more than most." She reached for his hand. This time, he took it without hesitation. When they returned to camp, Tasani spoke to his uncle, a quiet elder who arrived from the south with word of raiding parties and increasing settler movements. The old man looked Eliza up and down and saw something she didn't even see in herself. Strength, fury, rebirth. They were married beneath a cottonwood tree the next day, not with rings or vows, but with braided leather cords and the blessing of the land. No fanfare, no feast, just fire, sky, and the joining of hands that had both spilled blood to survive. Eliza wore the locket and a simple red cloth woven into her hair. Tasani marked his cheek with a thin line of ochre. When the elder finished the prayer, Tasani pressed his forehead to hers, and she breathed him in like clean smoke. It was not the marriage she'd once dreamed of as a girl. It was something fiercer, truer. But the world did not wait for joy. Word came that a rider had left Dry Hollow, gathering nearby settlers with talk of a demon woman and her savage husband who murdered 3 Christian men in the woods. A posse was forming, dozens of them, maybe more. This time they'd come armed with rifles and torches, and a preacher at the front. Tasani didn't flinch when the news reached them. "They're coming fast," his uncle warned. "For days, maybe less." Eliza stood by the fire, gazed distant. She didn't ask if they'd flee. They didn't run. They rode back toward the ridge, not to Dry Hollow, but to the place between, the no-man's land where the river split the canyon, where the rocks narrowed and formed a bottleneck. It was there they would make their stand. She scouted the paths, marked the ridges, helped set traps using old rope and sharpened stakes. At night, she carved her own rabbit from pine, as he had once done for her. She didn't speak while she worked. Her hands moved without thought. On the morning of the 4th day, she awoke to smoke on the horizon. They were coming. She dressed in buckskin, painted her face with red earth. The locket hung against her heart like a silent drumbeat. Tasani met her gaze. They exchanged no promises. Only one kiss, slow and steady, like they had all the time in the world. By noon, the posse reached the canyon mouth. Horses kicking dust, voices barking commands. Men with rifles and hard eyes. At their front rode Reverend Langley, black coat whipping in the wind, Bible held in one hand, pistol in the other. Behind him, Grig's father. And the rest, the cowardly, the furious, the desperate, the very ones who had sealed her in a shed and called it mercy. She stepped out alone, onto the high ridge above them. The wind tugged at her braids. The red cloth danced behind her. Langley stood in his stirrups. Eliza Granger, you stand accused of murder, witchcraft, and consorting with heathens. Step down, and we'll grant you a swift judgment under God's light. She stared at them, voice steady. You had your chance to bury me. You failed. Langley raised his pistol. Then you'll burn. He fired. The bullet struck rock just beside her, and from the trees behind them, arrows sang. Tasani's warriors had waited in silence, and now they moved like thunder through the canyon, bows loosing, rifles cracking. The settlers scattered, shouting, their lines breaking. Chaos reigned. Eliza ran the ridge, sliding down the slope to join the fray. She moved through smoke and gunpowder, eyes unblinking, her hands firm around the rifle. One man aimed for Tasani. She shot first. Another tried to pull a wounded warrior from his horse. She buried a blade in his gut. The fight was fast and brutal. Some fled. Some fell. Langley stood his ground until Tasani's horse knocked him from the saddle. He landed hard, breath gone. Eliza approached. He reached for his Bible. Not his gun. You've fallen, he wheezed, and God sees all. She pressed the barrel to his chest. I stopped asking him for help the day your prayers left me to die. She pulled the trigger, and it was over. The survivors ran. The canyon fell into silence again. Smoke curled into the sky. Tasani approached her slowly, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his blade bloodied, his expression unreadable. She looked down at her hands. They shook, not with fear, with release. He reached for her. She led him. Together. They stood at the edge of the river, red-stained water rolling over the rocks. Where are you now? He asked her gently. She looked toward the horizon, where no one waited to chain her, where no whispers trailed behind her steps, where the only future was the one she carved with her own hands. I'm your wife, she said. By fire, he murmured. She nodded, and by blood. Then they walked away, into the canyon, leaving the past buried behind them. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let the world remember her name. Eliza, the woman who would not die.